So the title of my talk is Zero Reference as a Strategy for Tracking Main Narrative Participants in Abawiri or Fwao. And so it's going to be talking about discourse and grammar and how they interact in a Papuan language. So first of all, let's see if we can make the slides work. Here we go. First of all, we'll be talking about Abawiri and the Lakes Plain languages in general. They've been known as a bit of an anomaly among Papuan languages, and that is indeed partially true. So we'll talk about that very briefly, and then we'll talk about zero reference and why we're using the term zero reference and not zero anaphora. And then we'll spend the majority of the time talking about zero reference specifically in Abawiri, both referential continuity and tracking topics. And in Abawiri, zero reference has both of these functions. So that's where we'll be going today. Starting out by looking at Abawiri and the Lakes Plain languages. Abawiri is spoken in the northern lowlands of Papua, Indonesia. You can see the language marked here with a dot on the screen, and we'll be zooming in here to this section to get a closer look. This is the ethnologue map from this particular area from the north western part of the island of New Guinea. The green at the bottom of the screen there, if it's showing up green on your screen, that is the Trans-New Guinea language family, the highlands, and the Lakes Plain language are kind of this mottled speckled purple there. It's a family of about 20 languages. Abawiri is the easternmost of these languages. And they're spoken in the upper Mamberamo Basin there, about next to the base of the mountain ranges. Abawiri specifically is spoken by about 500 people in a single village. The village is called Fwao, which is what the language has been known as in the literature until recently. Most of the people who speak Lakes Plain languages are actually still hunter-gatherers. Traditionally, they were all nomadic and all hunter-gatherer. And people in Fwao, as well as others in the region, still maintain that lifestyle to the current time, and have, for the most part, not adopted the agriculture practices of other New Guinea groups. So this is what we'll be talking about today. Now moving on to introducing what zero reference is before we talk about how it works in Abawiri. And before we proceed further, I'm using the term zero reference as opposed to zero anaphora, simply because I'm using the term a bit more broadly. Zero anaphora usually refers to looking back to a previous point in the discourse somewhere to resolve reference who is being referred to. I'm using it a little bit more broadly, talking about any use of a zero that is where there is a reference intended, and that's not always anaphoric to a previous point in the discourse. It could be just because of other kinds of things, and we'll talk later about what other kinds of reference are done with zero other than just simply backward looking back into the discourse. So I'm just using the term zero reference, although usually zero anaphora is mostly synonymous with what I'm talking about here. So Gavone has a 2017 book, The Story of Zero, where he talks about two types of zero anaphora. One of them he calls structural zero. Excuse me. And this is what we have in English, for example, what's been called equi-NP deletion, where you have two conjoined clauses. And the second one has an omitted subject, a zero subject. My mother went to the market and bought oranges. And here, my mother bought oranges. It cannot be the case that anyone else bought oranges. The subject of the second clause must be co-referential with the subject of the first clause. And this is because of this equi-NP deletion. It's a construction whereby the second argument or the second subject may be omitted in this particular context. So structural zero is a structurally constrained omission of an argument where it is co-referential with something else. Now, he says more broadly, there's this thing that's called natural zero, whereby any referent that is understood can be omitted. And this has to do with the functional motivations for language and communication, where if I as the speaker think that you as the hearer know what I'm talking about, I can simply omit that information. This is kind of the idea behind this natural zero. And that omission can be because of previous mention. If I've just introduced it into the discourse and you know that I'm talking about this, I might leave it out. Or if there's some other kind of shared knowledge. We live in a small community, we share this body of shared knowledge. We both know that both of us know this stuff, and so we can leave it out. And we've got both of these things going on in Abawiri, which we'll see in a minute. Now, Papuan languages tend to have what's called natural zero, unlike English, which tends to be pretty constrained in where zeros are allowed. It has more the structural zero, syntactic constructions where you have only a certain number of omissions that are allowed in specific slots. Mian, for example, is a Papuan language, a language that has what's called structural zero, or excuse me, natural zero. Sebastian Fedden's grammar of Mian, he says this: Mian is strongly zero anaphoric. Noun phrase arguments tend to be dropped if referent identity can easily be retrieved. And this is talking very much what Gavone would call natural zero. If the hearer can easily determine who the speaker is talking about, the noun phrase can simply be omitted. And it's a tendency, a discourse tendency, not a syntactic requirement. In Mian, as in many Papuan languages, there are still subject and object indexes which can facilitate referent tracking. So here's an example which I just copied from his grammar here. He left it and went back down. And this is in the middle of a narrative. There are no nominals here. There's no pronoun, no noun phrase, either for he or for it. However, you do have this third singular masculine subject agreement marker, as well as this third singular, I believe that's a particular noun class. You've got this object sort of a suffix as well in this fascinating indexing system that Mian has. But these other devices here on the verb aid in reference tracking. And this is pretty common to have subject, at least subject indexing, and often objects as well, which can be used to track reference when the noun phrases are absent because the identity can easily be retrieved. So usually zero anaphora is based on referential continuity. So if it was previously mentioned and that same referent is currently the intended referent, it can be left out. So in same subject sequences where you have a whole sequence of clauses where the subject is the same throughout, it tends to be zero. And this is quite common. Now, in Abawiri, we do have this as well. We have this referential continuity, but then we have this special function to track topics, which I want to talk about. And I'd also like to hear whether you think that this is widespread, more widespread than simply just being something unusual in the way Abawiri speakers use their language. Now, Abawiri is different from many Papuan languages in that there's no indexing on the verb, there's no agreement or bound person forms. And so the verb, many clauses don't have any nominals or pronouns or indexes. There's simply no referential devices or anything that would give the hearer an indication of who did what to whom. There's no switch reference markers either. In spite of this, any argument can be omitted. There are no syntactic constraints really that I have found around omission of arguments. Obligatory arguments simply don't seem to be a thing. Nothing is obligatory. This is a very common kind of clause. This is from the middle of a narrative. Toprowe, we went. Here the we is understood because of referential continuity. The previous bit of discourse was about we, this group of reference we, and so it doesn't have to be mentioned. Now, an unusual thing or an interesting thing about this principle is that nouns can be omitted even within nominal constructions. And the same principle of omission upon here being able to disambiguate is applicable here in these cases as well. So for example, noun phrases with an adjective, if the head noun is understood from context, but a modifier, the information from the modifier is not understood from context, then the modifier alone can be present without the head noun. The small ones are just pigs. The small ones are just pigs. And here, the group which is being referred to is already given information. It's known in the discourse. It's this group of pigs that might also be demonic, and they're debating whether they might be demonic or just normal, regular, physical pigs. And there is this specific group that's being discussed. And so we don't need to mention them. We just need to specify that of the small ones are normal. The big ones might be demonic. So the small ones, they're just pigs. No noun phrase needed. The same is true of relative clauses. You can have a relative clause without a head noun. And this is also because the referent is understood from context, but disambiguation is needed. So here there were a couple of crocodiles, and the guy wanted to eat the tail of the one that jumped. We don't have to say the crocodile that jumped. We can just say that jumped. If it is caught, I'm going to eat its tail. Postpositions frequently occur without a noun or pronoun as well. Tell them, or tell to them. This verb dawi is obligatorily has this toward postposition. And this is a very common way for postpositions to show up in discourse, is simply without the associated noun if it's understood. Here's how it works in real life, if you will. Here's a single referent, and under the principle of referential continuity, he doesn't have to be mentioned after he's introduced. It's the same good guy. There's a word for the good protagonist in a narrative. He simply doesn't have to be mentioned. So the good guy went from there to the other side. When 0 went to the other side, 0 went through tall grass. 0 crossed to the other side, and there was tall grass. 0 crossed through the tall place. Then it only came up to the knees. Then 0 crossed farther from there, and the grass only came to the ankles. So here we have this whole narrative where, or this is a whole segment of narrative where there's just one actor, and after he's introduced, he doesn't have to be mentioned. Switch reference can also be accomplished in this way. So here we have Boriwore and her younger sister. And I apologize, there is not enough space on the screen for the actual transcript. I'm just putting the translation here and the zeros to indicate, to make it simpler, to indicate what happened. So here we've got Boriwore squeezed Sego by herself, 0 squeezed Sego, and then 0 said to her younger sister. And now here we have a verb of speaking, and there is a recipient of the verb of speaking, someone who is spoken to, and now we've got a switch. Roast sego, roasted sego, and so now it's the younger sister that's being referred to through the principle of referential continuity after that switch. Roasted sego, line E. Then other sego was with cooked fish. Rolled cigarettes, gave them to. And in line G, we've got another switch, this time facilitated by the verb give. The actor gave to the recipient, and the most logical recipient is the person who had just given her a command earlier. And since the most logical referent of the verb in line G is indeed the correct one, it can be omitted. If the most likely one was not the correct one, then you would need to specify. But if the hearer is likely to guess the correct one, it's simply going to be left out. Okay, now the interesting part. We looked at referential continuity. If the hearer is going to guess based on principles of referential continuity, it can be left out. However, a main participant in a discourse, particularly in narratives here, can be referred to with a zero even after a discourse boundary of some sort. Even after a reset, going off and visiting a different topic for a bit, you come back to the main narrative participant. If the story is resuming with that main narrative participant, they can be referred to with a zero as well. You don't have to reintroduce them. So here we've got this whole narrative, and the key bit here is in line O. When the rain stopped, blank said. So here we've got lines A through F are all about we. The story is explicitly stated in the beginning, it's going to be about we. And then lines G through N are this break in the narrative where it's a different story about Domi. The main storyline resumes in line O. When the rain stopped, said, what shall do? The reference there, the intended reference, that are given in a translation of this text are we. And you resume with we, the main discourse narrative participants, because they are the main participants. We know that this mini story about Domi is finished, and it's most likely that we're going to resume the story about we, and that's indeed correct, so it can be zero. Here's another example. I don't have time to go into this in great detail, but it's the same basic principle, where in lines A through D, we have Rukahu, the main protagonist. In line D, there's the women. And then in line J, we go back to Rukahu, and she is indeed the correct referent, but referred to with zero, because we know it's going back to somebody else because of the way the narrative is running. And since that's the correct one, we can assume that it's the main one. Last thing before we close here, zero because of contextual knowledge. It's not always because of looking back at a previous point in the discourse, as we've seen so far. Sometimes it's zero simply because of the speaker and the hearer both know the story. They both know the context. And you simply can leave out mention of who did it because we both already know. It's kind of like, why bother telling you who did it when you already know who did it? And this particular short narrative was recorded by one of my local colleagues. I didn't get this narrative because I think because I, as an outsider, don't have this contextual knowledge, and they tend to give more overt nominal forms with me. But this story was one Foal person to another, and there are no nominals referring to the main protagonist in the whole short narrative here. It's a narrative about going and looking for Jeria, which in Indonesian is pohon matoa, and they were looking for them, and they felled them and brought them home, and so on. And they never once mentioned who did it because the listener knew it was this group of villagers that went and did it. So in conclusion, zero reference in Abawiri is natural zero. Any referent understood from context can be omitted. We do not have structural zero where there are syntactic constraints on omission of arguments. The pragmatic context dictates where the zeros occur. And the two principles in effect are those of referential continuity and main participant strategy.